Welcome, Bourbon Hunters, and welcome to the shadows of Kentucky's rickhouses. Tonight, we're leaving the tasting notes behind and stepping into parts of bourbon history nobody talks about. The barrels that vanished, the towns that disappeared, the flavors that are gone forever, and the secrets buried under dirt, limestone, and decades of silence. Some of this whiskey will never touch a glass. Some of it literally haunts the soil, and some of it exists only in stories whispered between barrels. So pour yourself a glass, or just pour one for your imagination, and let's go hunting, where history is dark, flavors are lost, and bourbon becomes legend. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, rickhouse collapses weren't rare fluke accidents. They were a full-blown occupational hazard. These weren't just sheds tipping over. These were massive wooden cathedrals of whiskey, holding thousands of barrels, collapsing in seconds, turning entire flavor libraries into splintered, leaking chaos. When a rickhouse pancaked, distilleries suddenly found themselves staring down a perfect storm of nightmares. Insurance companies asking uncomfortable questions. Tax agents sniffing around for unpaid barrel duties. Prohibition rumblings getting louder by the year. And a workforce that suddenly wasn't too eager to clock in next to a pile of half-crushed whiskey bombs. Recovery wasn't just expensive, it was risky, slow, and could invite attention nobody wanted. So at many remote rural sites, the solution wasn't cleanup, it was burial. Collapsed warehouses were quietly pushed into pits, covered with dirt, planted over, and officially reclaimed. Barrels went down with them, some leaking, some still sealed, some untouched and probably aging beautifully in complete underground silence like the world's saddest, most forbidden private reserve. Paperwork was closed, maps were redrawn, and the distillery simply moved on. Which means somewhere beneath Kentucky soil, there are still barrels entombed in the dark, aging in total secrecy, bourbon mummies, waiting for a tasting note that will never come. If bourbon could haunt, these would be the spirits doing it. Bourbon's darkest nickname. Long before Angel Share sounded like something whispered by cherubs in a rickhouse loft, evaporating whiskey had a much colder name in bourbon towns. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the invisible ethanol vapor bleeding out of warehouses was blamed for sickness, fainting spells, mysterious illnesses, and far too often, deadly fires and explosions. Workers would walk into rickhouses that literally made them dizzy, nauseous, and sometimes unconscious before anyone understood what vapor saturation really meant. When fires tore through these wooden whiskey vaults, it wasn't just barrels that were lost, it was people. So the widows left behind gave the disappearing whiskey a name that didn't care about romance or marketing. The widow's tax. Because every gallon that vanished into the air felt like another husband who didn't make it home from his shift. Distilleries, understandably uncomfortable with that level of emotional truth, quietly retired the term and replaced it with something far softer, prettier, and much easier to sell. Angel's Share. Same vapor, same loss, much better branding. And just like that, one of bourbon's darkest truths got dressed up in a halo and sent into the tasting notes. Once upon a time, Kentucky wasn't just dotted with distilleries. It was dotted with entire towns that existed solely because bourbon existed. These were places that lived and breathed mash bills, barrel smoke, shift whistles. But when rail lines were rerouted, distilleries burned, and Prohibition rolled through like a wrecking ball in a Sunday suit. Some of those towns didn't just struggle, they vanished. Families packed up, churches locked their doors, post offices closed, and maps were quietly redrawn as if those places had never been there at all. Towns like Peytona, Tyrone, Craig Station, Big Spring, and parts of Old Glendale faded into farmland and tree lines. What looks like peaceful pasture today still hides old limestone wells, buried cooperage pits, cellar foundations, and, in some cases, forgotten barrels sealed in the dark. Plows pass over them, Cows graze above them. But underneath that quiet Kentucky soil are the bones of whiskey towns that once fueled the entire bourbon frontier. Farmland on the surface, whiskey skeletons underneath. Ghost barrels, the ones nobody can touch. Scattered across Kentucky and Indiana are barrels that time never forgot, but paperwork did. These are the orphan barrels, casks that lost their ownership, their brand lineage, their legal documentation, and sometimes even the distillery that created them. Fires, floods, bankruptcies, mergers, prohibition shutdowns, and plain old human will file that later mistakes, slowly erase their identities. And in bourbon law, if you can't prove where a barrel came from, what mash bill it used, and who owns it, you can't legally bottle it. Doesn't matter if it tastes like liquid gold. Without paperwork, it might as well be haunted furniture. So these barrels just sit, aging, quietly evaporating, slowly becoming legendary and completely untouchable. Some have been resting for 20, 30, even 50 plus years, developing flavors that modern rickhouses physically can't reproduce anymore. Old growth oak influence, different humidity cycles, slower angel share, the kind of whiskey that would make a collector cry into their Glencairn. And yet, by law, many of these barrels can never be sold, labeled, or released to the public. They are literally too good to be legal. There's even a long whispered industry theory that a few mystery releases over the years were quietly built around the rescued orphan barrels, slipped into blends like bourbon witness protection programs. No labels, no backstories, just a vague, small batch and a wink. Which means somewhere right now in a quiet rickhouse corner sits the best bourbon you'll never taste, slowly breathing, slowly disappearing, dying a beautiful, tragic whiskey death, while you're over here debating which store pick to grab. The silent bourbon graveyards. Tucked behind the tree lines and fence rows of old distillery properties are places the maps don't show. Quiet, overgrown patches of land that once served as bourbon dumping grounds. When barrels broke, batches failed, fires damaged stock, or Prohibition made certain whiskey was suddenly illegal to exist. Reporting those losses meant taxes, audits, and uncomfortable questions. So instead of paperwork, many distilleries chose shovels. Broken barrels, illicit Prohibition stock, fire-scorched whiskey, and let's not tell the government about this. Batches were quietly hauled into pits and buried like bourbon crime evidence. No manifest, no disposal records, just dirt on top and grass planted over it. Out of sight, out of tax brackets. And here's the part that makes environmental scientists twitch. Some of these barrel zones still bleed ethanol into surrounding soil and nearby creeks more than 100 years later. Traces of alcohol, sugars, fermentation byproducts have been detected in sediments long after the distillery buildings themselves disappeared. Which means there are places in Kentucky and Indiana where the earth itself is technically still drunk. So if you ever wander past an innocent-looking patch of weeds behind an old rickhouse and think, that ground smells sweet, congratulations, you may be standing on a century-old bourbon cover-up. When flavor went extinct. Before the era of climate-controlled yeast labs and sterile petri dishes, distilleries kept their most precious ingredient, yeast, in humble, unassuming vault rooms. These weren't fancy laboratories. They were wooden cupboards, clay jars, or maybe a corner of a cool cellar, where generations of living yeast strains quietly worked their magic, converting mash into bourbon with flavors that could never be fully captured on paper. But when fires swept through these wooden rickhouses, and they did, more often than you'd like to think, entire yeast libraries went up in smoke. Strains that had been nurtured for decades, carrying the subtle fingerprint of distillery style, vanished forever. Modern heritage yeast, the kind you see credited in fancy bourbon tasting notes, is often a reconstruction, a patchwork of surviving fragments, recollections, and educated guesses. It's not the original organism, it's a ghost trying to imitate its ancestor. Which means some bourbon flavors that once existed are literally extinct. You can't recreate them. You can't bottle them. You can only imagine what a 1920s rickhouse ghost yeast would taste like. In a glass today. Smoky, sweet, spicy, living proof that sometimes history evaporates before the angel share even gets a chance.
Cursed land and black zones. Not all land is created equal when it comes to bourbon. Some parcels in Kentucky and Indiana are quietly considered cursed territory by distillers, and for very good reason. Beneath the surface, you can find hidden underground ethanol vapor pockets, sinkhole-prone soil, old wells that have collapsed, and earth so soaked with alcohol that it actually shifts under a building. Foundations built on this land don't just crack, they subtly move, twist, and sometimes develop mold blooms and walls that no one can explain. Distilleries know these zones exist. They build around them, plant grass over them, and never talk about them in brochures. No maps, no stories, just an unspoken rule. Some land is better left alone. And yet, if a clever bourbon hunter knew where to look, they'd realize that some of the smoothest, richest barrels might just come from a warehouse carefully positioned next door to the haunted plots no one dares touch. It's a whiskey strategy, rickhouse style, risk-reward, and a touch of the supernatural.
Prohibition hideouts. When Prohibition hit, distilleries got creative and a little desperate. Barrels of whiskey weren't just tucked away, they were hidden like contraband treasure. Some were bricked into basement walls, left to age behind layers of mortar. Others were carefully lowered into deep wells, disappearing into darkness with only the occasional echo of evaporating bourbon. Limestone caves became secret aging vaults, with natural humidity and temperature control that rival modern rickhouses. And some barrels were simply buried in barns, forgotten under decades of dust, hay, and time. Many of these barrels were lost forever. Ownership vanished, records disappeared, and legal questions made retrieval impossible. Today, there are still cave systems where whiskey slumbers in sealed barrels, aging quietly, completely off limits. The liquid inside is technically untouchable. Bourbon ghost in a geological cathedral. Imagine that. Some of the greatest, smoothest, most complex whiskey you'll never taste is still out there, hiding in the dark, waiting for a hunter bold enough to stumble on the map nobody will give you. River heist rings. Bourbon theft wasn't some random act of mischief. It was organized, carefully orchestrated, and profitable. Along the Ohio River, where distilleries shipped barrels by the hundreds via barges, skilled hijacking rings made their living targeting shipments. Entire barges vanished overnight, slipping silently into the untraceable back channels, hidden docks, and secret warehouses. Insurance companies were paid off, claims quietly processed, and the bourbon itself, gone, like it was never made. Some historians theorize that certain legendary lost batches circulating in Prohibition-era Kentucky may have come straight from these river heists, whiskey that was never meant to be recorded, labeled, or accounted for. These thieves weren't just stealing booze, they were raiding flavor libraries, sending barrels of golden liquid into the hands of shadow operators, and creating bourbon legends that survive today only as whispers and anecdotes. For the modern bourbon hunter, it's proof that sometimes history tastes like crime, and it pours in eat. Well, hunters, we've wandered through the shadows of bourbon history tonight. Ghost barrels, vanished towns, orphaned yeast, buried warehouses. The stories are dark, the flavors are lost, and some of this whiskey will never see a glass. But that's exactly why we hunt, to uncover what's hidden, to remember what's forgotten, and to celebrate the mystery and magic that makes bourbon, bourbon. And if at any point you thought, wow, she sounds extra mysterious tonight, or maybe deeper, congratulations, you caught it. One chapter was proudly recorded by my husband Mock, who briefly took over the mic and lowered the average vocal point of this episode. Thank you for joining us in this Bourbon Hunter Anonymous therapy session. Pour one for the barrels we'll never taste, tip your hat to the master distillers we'll never meet, and keep hunting, because the secrets are out there, waiting for the curious, the brave, and the truly obsessed. Until next time, stay thirsty, stay curious, and stay anonymous.